Now, welcome to the third episode on the basics of medicine. Last time we defined the concepts of health, wellness, disease, and homeostasis. And today's goal is going to be to answer the question, how well are we? This will be our primary goal today, to understand the state of our health. And I think it's important to mention that I am primarily focusing on my reality, so the first world developed countries. Now, if you recall the first episode, we said medicine is the art and science of dealing with the maintenance of health and also the alleviation and cure of disease. This means that today's analysis will help us measure how medicine is performing. I understand that some of you already have an opinion on this, but what I present here are hard facts without my personal opinions, as best as I can. And again, my name is Davide Patti, I'm a scientist and I'm working as an independent researcher. Okay, let's briefly review our main concepts so far. First of all, what is health? We said health is a state of feeling sound in our body, mind, spirit, that allows us to meet our personal needs. We also said symptoms are a subjective expression of disease, and that the disease is always either a trauma disease or a chronic disease. Now, it's the symptoms that will influence your ability to fully meet your personal needs, always for the worse. This will, in terms, lead to a reduction in quality of life. Now, how does this happen? We said that chronic disease means that your body's homeostasis is on a lower level, which translates to a reduced quality of life. Now, let's find out how healthy we are as a population. Okay, how well are we in absolute terms? This is today's question. It's an extremely difficult question to answer. I think one can get lost easily. There's many variables to take into consideration, such as the population we select, the sample size, how we define disease, how we want to measure disease impact on our life, and much more. So how do I want to proceed? What did I do? I think it makes sense to try and do the best we can always. So in this case, I will try to answer 4 questions that I selected that I think will give us a decent picture of our health. Let's start with the first question, and probably the most important one, which is, what is disease prevalence in developed countries? To answer this question, or to answer any question, we're looking at statistics from developed Western countries, so European Union, the USA, Canada, and Australia. We also only want to consider studies from respectable sources. So what data did I find? Let's start. So this is the observations. So in 2010, the World Health Organization reports that in Europe, diseases in general cause 150 million healthy years lost. So it's DALYs, which stands for Disability Adjusted Life Year, DALY. And that of these 150 million years lost, 115 are lost due to chronic disease and 35 are lost due to trauma disease. Now, the same report states that of all disease-related deaths, 86% are caused by chronic disease. And actually, while I was preparing this one slide in particular, I was informed that my grandmother died. I don't know her cause of death, but I know she died with diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. Now, another European study looking at chronic pain, which per our definition represents a disease or a symptom of a disease. This study reports that 27% of the studied population lives with chronic pain, And I also found a UK study summarizing chronic pain studies. So it's a meta-analysis which reports a prevalence of between a third and half of the population suffering with chronic pain. Now, more observations. In the USA, the numbers I found are generally higher. One study mentions approximately 50%, so half of the population, is currently living with one or more chronic disease. Another study by the National Center for Health Statistics that looked at one class of chronic disease, the musculoskeletal disorders, reported that 54% of the US population suffers from at least one disease from this disease cluster. More data coming from the Australian government report an average prevalence of 1.6 chronic disease per person, and a study in Canada on chronic pain states that approximately 19% of adult population suffers with some type of chronic pain. Interestingly, we also find that worldwide there is a considerable difference in chronic disease prevalence between high and low income countries. Now, a word about the references. Remember, I'm trying to find the highest quality studies, so from the most unbiased sources as best as I can. And also, I've made the references visible on the slide. I don't like it in particular. I think they distract from what matters. In future, I will probably simply add the link somewhere on the slide or on the slide notes. Also, the reference formatting is inconsistent. Here, I think there's enough information and also links for you to find the articles, and that is what matters to me at this point. Now, in summary, regarding this one question, I think I can say there is not a lot of information on disease overall, a lot of statistics. Most statistics are either on a singular disease or disease groups. What I can say for sure is that chronic disease is much more relevant to us in a sense that it causes more healthy days lost compared to terminal disease. So the study that I considered, which are all from respectable sources, they indicate a chronic disease prevalence anywhere between 20 and 54%. So I believe I can say that a considerable portion of our population is diseased. Now, both the National Institute for Health and the World Health Organization indicate neuropsychiatric disorders, cardiovascular disorders, and cancer as the three main causes for these healthy years or days lost. And we also know that a large majority of deaths today are caused by chronic disease, and that chronic pain is also highly prevalent in the population. We can also say that in the USA we find higher chronic disease prevalence than in Europe or Canada. And lastly, that chronic disease is more prevalent in countries with higher income. Now, how well are we in relative terms? This is the second question, and it's to assess the state of our health in relative terms. In this case, I want to look at how well are we compared to other animals. Now, what data could I find? In general, I couldn't find data on disease prevalence in wild animals, so I was especially interested in data on chronic disease. But I managed to find some other useful information. Now, first of all, there are studies reporting chronic disease in domesticated animals. There is not much focus on the prevalence of such diseases, but we see that the selection of diseases is similar to what we observe in our species. I also found a study reporting higher incidence of chronic disease in lab rats compared to wild rats. So, somewhat the same thing. Interesting data comes from Professor Robert Sapolsky, he's a researcher and currently professor at Stanford. He investigated this particular question for a large portion of his life. So what is the disease incidence within and between different animal species, if you will, in their wild habitat? And he discovered that chronic disease incidence is higher in more developed species that were exposed to sustained emotional stress. Now, in conclusion, I can say that even though we do not have statistics about disease in wild animals, we can speculate that the numbers will be low due to the harsher conditions in the wilderness. I think this would result in a very early death of these animals. Now, within mammals, we observe more chronic diseases in species with higher emotional complexity. So higher perceived stress, such as emotional stress, is associated with more chronic disease. We said Herbert Sapolsky, he observed, for instance, that in baboons, type A personality baboons and low-ranking baboons are the most diseased ones. Now, lastly, we can say that domesticated animals present with a similar array of chronic disease to that of humans. Now, this is the third question. What are disease trends? It's also a comparative question. So let's look at the best data I could find. Statistics from the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control, show major changes in the leading causes of death in the last 110 years. There are less and less deaths by trauma disease, especially for infectious diseases, but there are more deaths by chronic disease. The CDC also reports that the deaths caused by chronic disease are decreased in the last 15 years. And we see that worldwide, so in developed countries, out of the 4 most prevalent chronic disease groups, so cancer, neuropsychiatric disorders, autoimmunity, and cardiovascular disease, only the incidence of cardiovascular disease has decreased in the last decades. Now, what are takeaway points here? We have less and less infectious diseases and more chronic diseases, and less people die directly from chronic disease. Yes. Now, there's one important point to make here, which might invalidate our first conclusion, which is the argument that we are diagnosing more of these diseases because we are improving diagnostic procedures and also physician awareness. It's, of course, a valid argument to keep in mind. Now, the last question I choose to ask, also an analysis in relative terms, is how healthy are we in our lifetime? For this, I present a graph from a study on chronic disease done in the United States, where we can see the prevalence of chronic disease in different age groups. Now, what can I observe? I can say that chronic disease prevalence increases with age, and also that most people with chronic disease have more than one chronic disease. Now, before concluding, I'd like to show you an illustration of a study which I referenced in the previous slides. It's a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a prestigious publisher in medicine. Now I'm presenting this graph with a specific reason, which is that one should always look at data with a grain of salt, look at what the data really means. In this case, the graph presents the top 10 causes of death for 1900 and 2010 in the USA. Now, what can we say? If we look at the graph, we can say one interesting observation is that heart diseases and cancer, which are 2 chronic diseases, were present and causing deaths already 110, 120 years ago. So chronic disease is nothing new. Another observation is that all infectious diseases in the list for 1900, so in this list, for 1900 account for a total of 0.5% of all deaths, as you can see, if you sum them up. I think this somewhat scales down the popular conception that infectious diseases were a considerable problem in those years, at least. That's a conception I had. Now, we also observe that today we have a more complex disease reality. So the clusters are much smaller. We see it on the right. At first glance, this graph can give you the impression that there's an improvement in overall causes of death, a reduction. This is, of course, false. It's obvious there's not less people dying, but it's that the 10 top causes of death cause less disease, so we have a more complex disease reality. So last but not least, I also noticed that this graph only describes the causes of death for a very small percentage of the population. So on the left side, we see 1800. So this is 1.1% of the population for 1900. And on the right, we see a total of 600. So it's 0.6% of the population. This, of course, is not much. It would be interesting to have details on the causes of death of the remaining 99%. I think that would be very interesting. So it's worth take some time to reflect on what the data really means and how relevant it is. I think this is something that we can always keep in mind. We always must keep in mind. Now, summarizing the 4 questions, I would say it's the first question that gives us the strongest negative feedback, while the other questions are giving us either a neutral or a slightly negative feedback. So it's only the first one that is the most relevant to us. Now, what is the overall result of the analysis? I think we can say that incidence, first of all, the incidence of the different diseases and disease groups has changed considerably in the last 100 years. We observe a significant decrease in traumatic infectious diseases, also a significant increase of new chronic diseases, and that in the last decade, we see a slight reduction in chronic disease-related deaths. Then we see that today a large majority of all healthy days lost are due to chronic disease, and also that most people die from a cause related to a chronic disease. Also, although data varies greatly, we can say that chronic pain is a substantial problem for a considerable part. Is a problem for a considerable part of the population. And lastly, we need to mention that we have the controversy regarding chronic disease. So we said that it might be that we see more chronic disease because we are becoming better at diagnosing them. Now, again, I say this could be, but we need to keep in mind that the number of people with an incurable disease is high. So I think at this point, this aspect loses relevance. So with these results in mind, overall, I believe we can say that we are not a healthy population, and that we must aim at a higher percentage of healthy individuals. And this in particular addressing the burden of chronic disease. So until next time, thank you for your attention.